This is the first of a series where I want to look at how we view the world differently from different cultures. So oftentimes comes in the terms of ethnocentrism or cultural relativity. There's a bunch of different technical terms, none of which really make any difference. But the key here is to understand that people in different places actually see, experience, and make decisions about the world very, very differently. And especially in the world we live in now, where there's the illusion of, of digital sort of unity, that just how false that digital unity actually is, because it masks the reality that we view the world very, very differently. The decisions we make, the world we see around us, the way that we interpret the behavior and concepts and attitudes of others is all very, very much shaped by our cultural background and basically what we call our worldview. And so what I want to look at is some of the concepts that sort of underlie that I think are really, really key if you want to make sense of not only of the world around you, but also make sense of how others see the world around you and how different that is than what you think of as normal. Let's take a look at Chinese society. Chinese society and American society are radically different, not only from different parts of the world, different beliefs and value systems, and also different ways of looking at the world around them. American society is very much based, at least now, on this idea of data, externalized measures, and sort of what we see as a concrete reality, things you can touch, things you can see, things that you can measure, that you can photograph, that you can capture on your camera, whatever. Chinese society doesn't work that way. And in fact, most of the world societies don't work that way. Chinese society is very much based in sort of several key factors, the first of which is the past. In Chinese society, as in most societies, the people that are around now are the manifestations of what occurred in the past. So they're the great grandchildren of somebody. They're from a particular place that has been there for a long time. And what's really, I think, hard for many Americans to understand is that goes through not only what you might call sort of collective memory, the memory that your family has of past relatives and the family's past history, but also back into a place that predates history and almost predates memory. And here's a classic example. This is a little, what's called land god shrine in a small village in Zhongshan, which is, outside of Hong Kong. And there's about 5 or 6 shrines, at least that I'm aware of, in this particular village. And this is just one of them. Now, this particular shrine was put there by the folks that live in the village. And this is one that they interact with on a weekly or monthly or yearly basis, depending on the individual. But the key here is there's a perception that somewhere in the vicinity of this particular concrete thing, it sort of looks like a bench, is actually a thing. You can call it a land god, you can call it a spirit. The Japanese would probably call it something like a kami. Americans don't have this concept. It isn't part of the Judeo-Christian, ethos. But for the Chinese, what it means is this particular thing that hangs around near here uses that sort of bench as a home, a place to rest, and most importantly, a place to interact. And so from that location, it watches and keeps track of what's going on in the land around it, not the village per se, but the land around it. If you live in a place like those houses next to it, then you're supposed to PR this thing, this spirit. You're supposed to give it offerings. You're supposed to make sure that it's not unhappy. And you're just supposed to make sure that you don't piss it off, because it has the ability, because it's not actually physically in our world completely, it has the ability to manipulate events, time, and other things in a way that the living can't. So on one hand, it could, for example, bring destruction to the entire world. So it's not a powerful God. But in this particular area, it has the ability to manipulate and make things, it changes the potential of whether things are going to happen or things are not going to happen. If things are going to go well for around it or things are going to go poorly around it. So think of it, if you're a gambler, it's having good luck or bad luck. And so keeping the entity, the spirit or kami that lives here happy is just a form of practical reality. If you believe in this thing, if you believe in things like this thing, then it's really stupid to not try to appease it, to keep it from being upset. In the same way that, you know, if you're walking by a police officer, you wouldn't intentionally get in their face and start yelling at them. That would be dumb. You know, you don't know what the consequences might be, but they're probably not going to be good. In the same way, this thing has the ability to interact at levels you don't. Now, what that also means is if you want help for things that are above your control, if you want to hope that things are going to get better, if you want assistance because you're going to go to Macau and go gambling or something like that, so you want to try to get some help in making your luck or fortune better, then it would be logical to go to this entity here and ask it for help. Maybe leave it some food offerings or alcohol or whatever it is it likes, to burn some incense to show respect. Because like its human counterparts, this thing has an ego. It's very aware of the world around it. And it wants to be noticed, and it wants people to pay attention to it, and it wants people to respect it. And so what you do is, this is a part of your world. You interact with it, you talk to it, you use it, you to a certain extent let it use you. And so on one hand, from a Western or an American standpoint, this is just sort of an exotic piece of Chinese, village, I don't know, architecture, art, whatever you want to call it. From the local Chinese standpoint, the folks that live in this village, this is a fundamental, logical, very practical part of their world. Not so much the actual sort of bench structure itself, but the entity that basically is seen as repository there. And so, their view of reality includes other than humans, other than measurable, other than things you can take a picture of on your phone. Japanese worldview includes something very similar, not quite exactly the same. It's maybe a little more formalized. This is usually falls under the term what the Japanese would call kami. This is an example. This is at a Shinto shrine in Takayama, a very cute little town in sort of north central Japan. And this is, again, the idea of a thing. There's a spirit that resides either in or around this very, very old tree that's actually, you can't see it here, but it's actually split at the top. It was hit by lightning once or twice. And it is seen as the spirit and or guardian spirit for part of the town. And I don't think it's by accident. It's very near the river that flows by the town. And so this is a very old tree. And typically in Japan, large old trees especially, along with other physical structures such as streams or waterfalls or such, are seen as spots in which these spirits reside. Now, the difference with the Chinese and the Japanese is that in many cases in the Japanese concept, you use physical objects that exist in the world around you as the repositories or places where spirits hang out, or what the Japanese would call kami. If you remember, the Chinese one was a human-made place. The Japanese much more tend to actually sort of leave kami in places that actually reflect some sort of physical manifestation. And the fact that you've got this very, very old tree plopped down here, which the town was probably sort of built around, means that the kami resides here. Now, notice there is a marker. You actually have a small statue in the center here, but the spirit is actually not in the statue. So it's not that you're actually honoring an effigy, you're honoring a thing which is largely invisible, but sort of hangs out, or at least is somehow connected to the tree. The statue is just sort of like a label or something that reminds people that this tree is not just a tree, but it's the spot where spirit lives. Like their Chinese counterparts, the Japanese have very strong attitudes that these spirits are very much in our world, that they very much can manipulate and change things in the world around them. If anything, Japanese kami tend to be more powerful or more formally structured than the Chinese tend to be sort of land gods, which tend to be pretty sort of weak, I guess you'd say. But Chinese kami or Japanese kami tend to be a lot more sort of powerful in terms of what they can do, or I suppose you might say how they can mess with people if they're not respected. And the fact that you have a whole shrine built around this particular tree and the kami that resides in the tree is sort of reflective of these Japanese attitudes. Now let's take a look at another one that's very similar. We're still in Takayama. This is a reconstructed sort of farming rural village museum outside of the town of Takayama called Hida Village. The farming houses that are there are actually placed on a piece of land owned by a very wealthy benefactor. So the houses are not from there. They're rural homes from all over Japan. But the interesting thing about that is what they did is they had to basically clear and modify the landscape and shape it to put these sort of, old new homes there. Think of a Japanese version of Williamsburg in Virginia. In that process, apparently, one of the things that they bumped into, the guys that were doing the work, clearing the land and turning this sort of museum park, was interacting with kami that they found, if you would, in the landscape. And this is one of the important things to remember about it, especially in Asian societies, but in many societies, is that things that live in partially in our world, but partially not quite in our world, oftentimes are very land-based, they're very place-based. Again, this is something that especially American society, which is almost entirely settler-based, the huge majority of Americans come from someplace else. They might have been in the United States for a couple of hundred years, but in many cases, they still identify with where they were originally from. And for many people in the world, that's not the case. As far as they're concerned, they've always been. It's certainly true of Hawaiians. It doesn't matter that historically they came from somewhere else. Their identity of places, this is their home, and it's always been their home. And I think, again, this is something that's very hard for Americans to understand or grasp. You see this struggle going on a lot when they're dealing with Native American land rights. They're sort of like, well, Native Americans, especially Plains Indians, were nomadic, so how could you say you're from here? And what they're not understanding is there's a difference between the idea of migratory nomads, which would be most Americans in the sense of members of American society who are originally from Ireland or from Italy or from Greece or whatever, and folks that see themselves as having been embedded in the landscape for hundreds and thousands of years. The Japanese see themselves in that landscape. The Japanese see themselves in a world that has many mysteries, that has places that they don't really know about till they show up there. And so what you see here is another kami. This is another god. This is another land spirit. This particular one was apparently found when they were clearing this spot, I think, to put down this sitting area and then sort of presentation for a nearby farmhouse. The construction guys undoubtedly either cut down a tree, that would be my guess, or moved a large boulder, and either felt something or something happened soon after. They came to the conclusion that there was some sort of a spirit there that they had disturbed, and it needed to be placated, appeased, and whatever you want to call it. And so they set up sort of a marker, and this marker is what you see here. So very typical in Japanese society, you have to intuit this stuff. There's not obviously, there was probably a tree here, but there's trees all over the place. There might have been a boulder here, but this place is full of boulders. The fact that this one was more than just a rock or more than just a tree is due to the feeling and or intuition, whatever phrase you want to use, of the folks that were here. Now, by making this little marker, by putting this up, and initially it wouldn't have had the little marker, imagery, and it wouldn't have this stuff, would have just been a rock. But people would have been leaving offerings, probably food offerings, maybe coins. Other people coming by would have seen those in Japanese society and thought, oh, if people are leaving markers here, that means that there's something here. Since I'm here and I don't want to piss this off, or maybe I can use a favor, I'll leave a few coins too. So what happens over time is that you end up putting a little money box here so that people can leave offerings that if they feel like. Someone has put up a nice little bamboo cup, and then people are leaving flowers and or leaves or other plant material as gifts or honors to this. At some point, someone brought one of the stone effigies that are used as markers of kami and put it up here. And someone or someone else then clothed it. And people will come by and do this. And in many cases, it's very spontaneous based on their perception that there's something going on here. They might not even be particularly sure what it is, but they do know that they don't want to take a chance that you could piss it off. And so what you're going to do is your best option is to leave a little bit of something, say thank you or genuflect in front of it and say sort of like, hi, how are you? And if you've got anything you want to ask it or maybe a little help, then do that. And then you move on. It's not a part of a ritual world that Americans are familiar with. It's not part of churches and Sunday services and sort of collective stuff. This is very much individualistic. Granted, there's more than one individual doing it, but I can guarantee that most Japanese that interact with a civil shrine probably don't really have a lot of interest in how other Japanese interact with the shrine. It's a very personal thing to do. Last and maybe much more famous would be deer in Nara, or actually deer in much of Japan, but especially in certain areas like we'll just use Nara as an example. When you look at the deer in Nara, I think again especially from an American standpoint, and you'll see this in a lot of the tourist literature, the idea that the deer are sacred and somehow the deer gods or the deer spirits. That's not actually quite accurate. Japanese are very aware that the deer they're just deer. They hang around, they get munchies from people like the lady back here that have special deer food to feed them. They go and harass, especially schoolgirls, and try to get snacks, especially sweets, out of their purses. So they're just being deer. Having said that, the particular deer around this particular area in the city of Nara, which is one of the old, probably second of the imperial Japanese capitals before Kyoto, have been interpreted by both Shinto and also Buddhist religion in this part of Japan as being sacred to the gods. And so the deer aren't just deer. The deer basically are just deer doing whatever deer do, but they have the ability, like that tree, to act as a repository, a place, or a location for spirits to hang out. And so the general attitude would be that 99 out of 100 deer are just doing their deer thing. But every once in a while, one like maybe this deer here are then, I suppose, for lack of a better term, possessed, if you would, by one of these spirits. And it so happens that the spirits in this particular part of Nara are considered very powerful, commonly very powerful spirits. In fact, they're considered god spirits. And so, you don't want to go around chasing the deer because 9 out of 10 deer just might be deer and they could care less. They're just doing their deer thing. But that 10th one you start trying to chase around might be this one. And at that moment, it might be possessed by a god or goddess. And they're probably not going to be particularly happy when you come up screaming to them, waving your arms and trying to get them to run. These deer are treated very carefully because these deer have the ability to really make your life miserable very, very quickly. Not when they're being deer, when they're possessed or the place in which one of these spirits is hanging out. So notice how this means that not only, maybe the tree in the background, but also animals, locations, objects can actually be manifested of a much more complicated world than what you see in the reality of this picture or this image. And that's the way that you've got to understand that most people see the world around them. The world around them just isn't what they see in front of them. The world around them is a very, very complicated place, much of which they really can't see. And I don't care how good your camera is, how good your eyesight is, you're not going to see the god and the deer. That is open to intuition and awareness that the world's a much more complicated place than the reality that we tend to take around it. It's also why Japanese tend to get very irritated with visitors when they come to places like Nara and start giving the deer a hard time, which is actually a misdemeanor offense under Japanese law. And the Japanese aren't just being jerks about it. They're deathly afraid if someone pisses off a deer when there's a spirit inside of it, that spirit's not going to care whether just about the person that pissed it off. The deer's also going to be pissed off at all the Japanese who are around there that didn't do anything to make that not happen. This is a concept we'll see in the future where if you're part of a group that interacts with these things, one of your obligations is to make sure that things run smoothly. It isn't enough to say, oh, I didn't know, I wasn't there. whatever is the spirit that's hanging out in this deer is not going to be at all mollified or appeased just because you were ignorant. They're still going to punish you for it. So ironically, the folks who are Japanese, who are supposed to be protecting the deer, might get punished a lot worse than the tourist that's actually harassing the deer because they want to post it on their, Instagram account.